Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are very pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. On today's episode, we're very honored to have distinguished Civil War and Reconstruction historian Brooks Simpson with us, and he's going to discuss Reconstruction related to his fabulous essay in the BRI textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. By way of introduction, Dr. Brooks Simpson is an ASU Foundation Professor of History at Arizona State University and is an expert in American political and military history as well as the American presidency, specializing, as I said, in the Civil War and Reconstruction. He's the author of some 15 books, including, I just happened to pull a few off my library shelves, America's Civil War, The Reconstruction Presidents, also Ulysses S. Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, and Let Us Have Peace, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Politics of War and Reconstruction. Brooks, thank you very much for your contribution to the BRI textbook, and thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here, Tony.
Great. Well, let's dive right in, shall we? Can you explain some general historical background of how the course of the war and of emancipation helped shape differing ideas about Reconstruction?
Certainly. I think, first of all, you could actually argue that Reconstruction in some format began with the secession crisis. And what I mean there is that the only way to resolve that crisis one way or another was to reshape the Union, the Republic, and that any compromise that might have headed off secession or avoided civil war would in itself have been constructing the Union anew. And I think that's one thing we need to understand. Reconstruction can mean reestablishing what is already there, restoration, which is a word Andrew Johnson used, or reconstructing as constructing anew. I think that those tensions in that word you see throughout this period. Once war begins, I think the real challenge of the Lincoln administration was to come up with a policy that would look beyond military victory to the reestablishment of a reunited states. I think that shaped how military operations were conducted. Do you want to fight with a sword in one hand, but you want the olive branch in the other? Because in the end, a war merely of conquest would leave you with a devastated area that you'd have to occupy militarily for maybe a century or so. You're trying to restore the Union, trying to bring people back. And what I think Lincoln understands after a while during his first couple of years in office is that that's going to be harder than he thought it was going to be, that he'd underestimated Confederate will and persistence. He also underestimated the degree, I think, to which the advent of war would affect the thing that white Southerners were most sensitive about, which was the protection of the institution of slavery. And that in turn, Union military victory depended on striking at white Southern morale and Confederate resources. And among those resources was the institution of slavery. So as the war to preserve the Union also becomes the war to destroy slavery, that's going to complicate Reconstruction a great deal, because white Southerners, even if they didn't own slaves, and the majority of them did not, still saw slavery as an essential part of the white Southern way of life. And to destroy slavery and to have African Americans as potentially equals in a post-war Southern society petrified them, much as it petrified a lot of white Northerners to think of African Americans as equals. But the more you try to secure Black freedom, Black equality, Black opportunity, the more likely it is you're going to offend a substantial number of whites, Southern whites and American whites, who simply want the war over, restore things the way they were in a society which was fundamentally white supremacist and where African Americans would have a subordinate role in that world. No historian has ever framed how a policy that could have met both the goals of reconciliation with white people, Southern whites, bringing them back in the Union, restoring the Union, how do you balance that with the need to guarantee the fruits of emancipation for African Americans? So it was a dilemma that daunted policymakers at the time, and it plagues us still.
Not very easy, is it?
No.
So my next question is, what were those various proposals about Reconstruction? Because there were some different plans put forth from Lincoln, as well as President Andrew Johnson, and also the radical Republicans over in Congress. And so, how are they shaped by the respective views of these different groups and individuals, their views about the Union and constitutional authority?
Okay, I think during the American Civil War, again, Abraham Lincoln tries his best to restore the Union by offering solutions to white Southerners, in part because he didn't believe that there was a lot of support for the Confederacy that would persist for as long as it did. And so the Lincoln administration, I think, moved slowly at first on the issue of slavery because it understood that to emancipate African Americans, to threaten institutional slavery, would offend white Southerners and would redouble commitment for the Confederate cause. Once emancipation, however, becomes a war measure, then the Lincoln administration tries to develop ways to reconstruct civil governments in the South that welcome the returning loyalty of white Southerners. And that if those governments simply accepted Black emancipation, destroyed slavery, and came back in the Union, that might be enough. And that's where Lincoln is at the end of the war itself, because his number one objective at that time is to subvert support for the Confederacy by offering white Southerners a way back. With the end of the war, even he admitted at his last cabinet meeting that the conflict having resulted in victory, he now had to reassess what would be the proper sort of Reconstruction policy to pursue in a post-war period. Doesn't get the chance to do that, obviously, when he's assassinated. His successor, Andrew Johnson, viewed Reconstruction primarily as restoration. Remember, Andrew Johnson's a white Southerner, came from slave states, represented the state of Tennessee, was a reluctant emancipationist, accepted Black inferiority and white supremacy to an extent that people said that he was morbid on the issue of African American equality. Even for the time, we talk about understanding people in the context of their time, but even in the context of his time, people found Andrew Johnson to be a diehard racist, a bitter ender on this issue. And so Johnson's view of Reconstruction would be the quick readmission of white Southerners into the Union, coming back on an equal footing, except for some Confederate leaders, the Jefferson Davises and the Robert E. Lees. He had no problem trying to prosecute them for treason. But that there would be a restoration of a fairly conservative white supremacist social, economic, and political order. Now, Republicans and radical Republicans were part of the Republican Party, not the whole party, but Republicans wanted some guarantees for African American rights, and they also wanted in some way for Southerners, white Southerners, to acknowledge that they had lost, that secession was now a dead letter, and to understand what defeat meant. Johnson, on the other hand, sort of encouraged a belligerence among Southern whites that really made Republicans wonder who won this war, and did all those lives that Northern families had sacrificed, had they died in vain? Republicans also watched white Southern behavior towards African Americans in the early months of emancipation, the violence shown against African Americans, the closing off of opportunities, the unequal treatment of African Americans under law. And they begin to try to protect African Americans, first by granting them equal civil rights with federal protection for those rights and federal intervention in cases where Southern state courts did not provide protection for African Americans. And then when white Southerners kept on pushing back, kept on trying to restore the old order. They went beyond that foundation, which would be the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, and the 14th Amendment, which is proposed in 1866. It's going to be ratified in 1868. And they go into what are called the Reconstruction Acts, where they basically undo the civil governments that Andrew Johnson and Lincoln had established during and right after the war, and reconstruct those governments with new constitutions in which African Americans play a part as voters and office holders and as delegates to shape a new kind of future, but still a future that represented a return to civil government as quickly as possible. Some radical Republicans would have preferred that the federal government would have supervised the former Confederate states far longer. And both Thaddeus Stevens, the congressman from Pennsylvania, and Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, thought that basically the South should be territorialized and placed under federal control until things were straightened out in such a way as to preserve Black rights. So the restoration of civil government becomes a complicating factor, because once that government is restored, the authority of the federal government under the Constitution to deal with these governments, especially in time of war, the Civil War itself is not going to be declared officially over until 1866. As those state governments come back, the federal government surrenders what authority, what influence it has in those states. And only through constitutional amendments and the clauses that gave Congress the power to enforce those clauses by appropriate legislation was the federal government able to have any sort of oversight into what was going on in the American South in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, especially the terrorist violence that continued to plague the area as white supremacists continued to go after African Americans and their white allies.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to that really important topic of African Americans during Reconstruction. So you mentioned that there were gains in constitutional rights and political rights for Black Americans during Reconstruction. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, starting in the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, which is ratified at the end of 1865, does end the institution of slavery in almost all cases, except for issues of imprisonment, et cetera. But it basically ends the institution of slavery across the board. Slavery had come to an end during the war in various states through constitutional conventions and through elections. But this made the end of slavery national, even in states that had not joined the Confederacy during the conflict. Remember, there are slave states that remained in the Union. Slavery is now destroyed across the nation. Then in 1866, you have a push for Black civil rights, equality under the law, equal treatment in courts. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Freedmen's Bureau legislation that extended the use of military commissions in case where Southern civil courts did not hand out equal justice to people, whether they were white or Black. And then the 14th Amendment, which establishes a national citizenship, declares that African Americans are part of that national citizenship, and authorizes Congress to legislate to protect that national citizenship, and that those people should be treated equally. Before that, citizenship was primarily a state responsibility. So again, these three major measures in 1866, Civil Rights Act of 1866, which provides for federal intervention in cases where states do not respect equality before the law for all of their residents. The extension of the Freedmen's Bureau bill, which established the provision for military commissions to intervene in cases, again, where Southern courts were not treating African Americans equally. Those provide equality under law. They're followed by the 14th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1866, in part to avoid a presidential veto. Remember, constitutional amendments are not subject to the veto process, and sent out to the states, ratified by 1868, establishing national citizenship, including African Americans, and defining protections for that citizenship that authorize federal intervention. So those three pieces of legislation taken together represent a significant expansion of federal authority under the Constitution in peacetime. They're followed the following year by Reconstruction Acts, which again are an expansion of federal authority, however temporary, in which the federal government, through the United States Army, supervises a process of registering voters and overseeing the establishment of new constitutional conventions in which African Americans play a part as voters and as delegates, and later on as elected office holders, to reshape the southern state governments, again to provide equality for African Americans as well as for protective measures. This expansion of federal power was probably realized, climaxes in the 15th Amendment, which is framed in 1869 and ratified in 1870, which says that you can't use race, color, or previous condition of servitude to bar someone from voting. This makes Black suffrage national. Republicans did this again in part to avoid any kind of obstruction of the process, although by this time they had a friend in the White House with Ulysses S. Grant. But they also understood that many whites, including whites in the North, were not friendly towards the issues of Black equal civil rights or political rights, and that the constitutional amendment process, by going through state legislatures and not a popular referendum for ratification, enabled Congress to make sure that African Americans would have constitutional protections that a decade before no one could have imagined.
Right, great. So part of the story is great constitutional protections, many political gains, and yet, on the other hand, in what ways did African Americans have those rights then quickly curtailed by these white supremacist regimes of violence and legal discrimination?
Okay, violence against African Americans, once the institution of slavery is destroyed during the American Civil War, starts up in 1865, long before there's a plan of Reconstruction operation. That by the end of 1865, we have the origins of the Ku Klux Klan. There are major massacres of African Americans in cities such as Memphis and New Orleans and Norfolk in 1866. So violence against African Americans by white supremacists precedes Republican policymaking. Republican policymaking is a response in part to that violence. Some people would like to say the Republican policies sparked that violence, but in fact, it's the other way around. The violence sparked more active Republican measures. In fact, I think you can argue that Reconstruction would not have been as radical as it turned out to be if it wasn't for the efforts of white Southerners to subvert Black opportunity, freedom, and liberty. That the violence angered, upset Republicans in particular, who kept on adopting more and more radical measures that they never would have conceived of in the first place had white Southerners been much more tactful and more accepting of let's say, a reasonable second-class citizenship for African Americans. That might have survived. So once these measures take place, however, the amount of terrorism that goes up, the amount of voter suppression, and voter suppression by intimidation and by outright murder becomes very visible in 1868 and 1869. And though the Grant administration claims victory, it's important to remember that a majority of the people who were white in 1868 voted for Horatio Seymour, the New York Democratic candidate, former governor of that state, who had actually addressed the whites who instigated violence against African Americans in 1863 in New York City during the infamous draft riots. He'd addressed them as my friends. So a majority of white people actually voted for Horatio Seymour. Grant would have still won in the Electoral College, and by now I think we're very familiar about how the Electoral College operates. But Grant's popular vote majority was due to the first um, significant political participation of African Americans in a national election. And that was really important. It was also important, therefore, for Democrats and white supremacists to try to suppress that vote by whatever means they could. And during Grant's first administration, there are going to be additional measures passed to try to protect African Americans against such violence. There is the creation of the Department of Justice under the Grant administration to prosecute people who violate these laws, a series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts to try to protect African Americans. But this, I think, is where the limits of constitutionalism at the time became more visible, because people thought that there really shouldn't be too much protection for African Americans, and the legal threshold for demonstrating violence against blacks because they were black remained rather high. Also, there's also public support for this, and then there was a series of Supreme Court decisions that gut federal enforcement efforts. And with the resurgence of the Democratic Party in Congress, especially in the House of Representatives by 1874, there's no opportunity to pass new legislation that might have done something. And frankly, there wasn't the popular will or support to do so.
Gotcha. And how does this struggle over Reconstruction between President Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress you've been discussing, how does that lead to Johnson's impeachment?
Andrew Johnson was a master obstructionist. And he pioneered the use of the veto to try to counter Republican measures in a way that his Democratic heroes, such as Andrew Jackson, had first used the veto during his first term. In Johnson's case, however, Republican policies during 1866 were shaped by a desire to obtain veto-proof majorities in both houses of Congress in the off-year elections of 1866, as well as to circumvent Johnson's vetoes by going through the constitutional amendment process, which is not subject to presidential veto. But Congress could, on occasion, as with the Civil Rights Act to preserve equality before the law, they could actually and did override presidential vetoes. And it's not the first time a veto had been overridden, but it's the first time such a significant piece of legislation became law over a presidential veto. Johnson's obstructionism continued. In turn, Republicans became more focused on trying to control Andrew Johnson's behavior. Including Johnson's control of the United States Army and a growing conflict between the president and the General-in-Chief of the Armies of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. And key to this was a piece of legislation passed in 1867 along with the Reconstruction Act, called the Tenure of Office Act, that said the President of the United States could only suspend from office anyone who had been appointed with a confirmation by the United States Senate cabinet officers, for example. And that in turn, the Senate would have to concur with that removal for that individual to be removed. And that when Congress was not in session, you could name a temporary replacement, but sooner or later you had to present the case for replacement to the Senate, and the Senate might say no, and you've got a Republican-controlled Senate that is not going to agree with the president, except under the most dire circumstances. There's also something called the Command of the Army Act, which is a rider which says that all onto an appropriations bill, and the rider said that any orders issued by the President of the United States to military personnel had to go through the General-in-Chief of the Armies of the United States, because they didn't want Johnson to set up his own army in opposition to the United States Army. Something Johnson had talked about in various ways, using military force to recognize a Congress of his own choosing as opposed to the legitimately elected Congress. So we are in 1867-68 in a constitutional crisis. Johnson actually complies with the procedure outlined in the Tenure of Office Act at first, He suspends his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and puts Grant in as a temporary replacement. Grant accepts that because he's afraid of what Johnson might do. But when the Senate confirms that Stanton should stay in office and Grant allows Stanton to regain the office because he's obeying the law, Johnson begins to look for ways to thwart that legislation and in the end defies it. And I mean, that's where Johnson was. When Grant said he would not defy the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson said, I'll pay your fine and serve your prison sentence, which is not exactly a display of an understanding of how the process runs for a man who said he was so committed to the Constitution. Johnson's repeated obstruction leads to his impeachment, again, indictment in February of 1868. And he's acquitted by a single vote, in large part because Republicans are concerned that the person who would have become president of the Senate, remember Johnson as a vice president becomes president, there is no vice president. Benjamin Wade of Ohio, a radical Republican, had radical positions on a number of issues, including economic issues. If he became president, that might damage the party's chances to win the White House outright in 1868. And by the spring of 1868, most Republicans had decided that Grant, the great war hero, would be their standard bearer in 1868. So as long as they could contain Johnson and get what they wanted, just as well to leave Johnson in office and hope to mute his obstructionist tendencies. So Johnson's acquittal, therefore, we know now impeachment is a political act. His acquittal is a political and not a legal decision.
Right. And speaking of Grant, was Grant's approach to Reconstruction any different, and did it do any better with regard to both protecting Black rights as well as reconciling the divided nation?
Well, we've heard a lot lately about which presidents have done more for African Americans than any other. But it could be said that after Abraham Lincoln, at least in the 19th century, Ulysses S. Grant would be the most avid advocate of Black equality and protection of Black rights all the way down into the middle of the 20th century. And the irony here is that Ulysses S. Grant is also the last slaveholder to be elected president of the United States. He had owned a slave in the 1850s, had married into a slaveholding family, but during the Civil War embraced emancipation, the enlistment of African Americans in the United States Army, and afterwards had fought for Black equality before the law and for protecting Black rights. So by the time he becomes president, he's about as good a chief executive as one could expect, who could be both electable and defend Black rights. And he's willing to do so using military force when necessary. And so there are some bright moments here, in Grant's first term in particular, in which the force of the federal government is mobilized to protect African Americans against violence. But that support falls off in the second term. There's a major economic depression that begins in 1873. And when the economy is down, people think about their own welfare, not the welfare of others. The Democratic Party wins the off-year elections of 1874, and a series of court decisions really pulls the teeth out of the legislation that had been passed in the early 1870s. Grant used to be criticized for being less than a politician, but in this case, Grant made a political decision. He understood that political support for African American rights was declining, and that while he was not going to lead a retreat from Reconstruction, what he understood he was doing is commanding a fighting withdrawal, and that white Northerners as well as white Southerners were not willing to embrace a policy of federal protection for African Americans against white supremacist violence, and that proved to be the case. So it's a mournful retreat from Reconstruction. We can express regret about it today, but Grant's political realism grasped that if he did not manage this fighting withdrawal, that the Democratic Party would come into power, and Democrats had no sympathy whatsoever for Black rights and would have, in fact, imposed a much more hostile regime than Republicans might have overseen.
Right, understood. Final question. So why does Reconstruction come to an end, and what's the result for African Americans and for the country generally, the future of the country?
Reconstruction comes to an end, first of all, because I would argue that it was built upon a flawed foundation, that the restoration of civil governments in such a hasty manner meant that a lot of the fundamental changes that might have had to take place for African American rights to be respected were simply missed. That and that the federal government was not going to enforce uh, uh, legislation and laws that would really give African Americans some protection. And of course, in the early days, not only do you have a decision to reestablish civil governments, but there's also a decision made during the Johnson administration to make sure that African Americans will not be the beneficiaries of confiscated plantation lands that could be redistributed to them. There's also no economic basis for Black freedom, and African Americans can struggle in that situation. In the 1870s, again, despite this momentary expansion of federal power that we see in the late 1860s and through 1870 with the ratification of the 15th Amendment and then the ensuing enforcement acts, there's a decline in Northern will more than anything else. White Southerners during the 1860s and 70s fight for white supremacy in a way they never fought for Confederate independence. There's a lot of talk about how white Southern will leads to the collapse of the Confederacy, that they become discouraged. But they're not discouraged when it comes to promoting white supremacy by whatever means necessary, including these horrific massacres of African Americans, especially during Grant's term, over 100 African Americans killed in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, widespread violence in New Orleans and Mississippi in 1874 and 1875, more violence in South Carolina in 1876. And those are the most prominent examples of such violence. That although the Ku Klux Klan as an organization fades when federal enforcement acts really pound at that organization, there are other white supremacist organizations that take their place, white leagues and red shirts and the like, that prove really determined foes. So white Southerners fight hard to win that guerrilla war, that unconventional war, and white Northerners who were quite unified over saving the Union and destroying those people who were shooting at their sons and fathers and brothers and the like, had no such interest in using federal force in quite the same way or with quite the same enthusiasm or energy when it came to protecting African American rights, because many white Northerners themselves harbored racial prejudices and really didn't have that commitment to Black equality that they had to preserve the Union. You have court decisions that narrow the scope of federal power. You have political setbacks that hamper Republican efforts to legislate federal solutions. You have an economic crisis which changes people's attention in other ways. And you also have a war weariness, that people have had enough. And they think that if we can just drop Reconstruction and live our lives the way we want to, everything will be better. So by the 1870s, there isn't a lot of support anymore for those policies. And to offer support for more vigorous policies to support Black rights was becoming more and more politically suicidal for Republicans.
Dr. Brooke Simpson, I want to thank you very much for your insights today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Tony.
And we want to thank you to our viewers for joining us as well. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel and offer your comments below. We put out new videos every Tuesday and Thursday exploring U.S. history and civics topics, including our primary source close reads, scholar talk interviews with distinguished scholars from across the country, and homework help videos for students. To find Brooks's compelling essay and many others, teachers can access our new digital textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, using the link in the description. And come join our conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates on programs, events, and how you can get involved with BRI. Thank you.